evening, good evening, good evening, good evening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to you, sir. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation. Is it your first time here? Anybody? Everyone been here before? So you'll all appreciate what CG is and what we do and what we're about here. We are the Center for International Governance Innovation. What we do, we're a think tank or a public policy research institution, and what we focus on is some of the most pressing issues in global public policy. And I can think of no more pressing issue than the changes that we're seeing in global security dynamics right now. We're seeing rising powers. We're seeing Russia being more aggressive in cyberspace. We're seeing China asserting itself in ways we've never seen before. We're seeing kind of a retraction of traditional powers. The power dynamic is shifting. Global policy is shifting. Geostrategic interests are shifting. And so too must our institutions. And one of the primary institutions at the forefront of North American defense is NORAD. And tonight we have an exceptional speaker, and I could think of no one more qualified to speak on this topic, to tell us about NORAD and how it's adjusting to these trends. Cyber, the change in geostrategic interest, the rising powers, than Lieutenant General Coates. He is the Deputy Commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, out of the Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which, by the way, is a little piece of heaven. It's gorgeous there. If I were to go through Lieutenant General Coates' biography in detail, it would read like a PhD dissertation. To say that this man is accomplished would be the understatement of the evening. But let me just focus on a few things. He has led he's been on the air and aviation planning for Canadian missions from Haiti to Honduras. He's been on the Canadian tactical aviation deployments for both Bosnia and Kosovo, air support for the French-led mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as Canada's mission to Afghanistan. He is a decorated soldier, and he's one of the people that works at the forefront of keeping Canada safe and Canadian national security. Please help me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Lieutenant General Coates.
Thanks so much. Whoa. It's a bad start. Hi, good evening. Thanks very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you today to talk a little bit about North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. Probably most of you don't hear much about NORAD, and maybe that's a good thing for the most part. But I'm thinking, from my perspective at least, that NORAD is becoming increasingly important in our affairs, in the security of our nation, and so an opportunity to talk to you about why it's important and the growing attention that perhaps needs to be placed on continental defense and security is timely tonight. Donc, je dis bienvenue à tout le monde ici ce soir, puis c'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous. A couple of words about who I am, and I'm thankful for the short introduction. I am a helicopter pilot, but I've been doing air defense for a while. I started flying little green helicopters like these ones over Germany, and then eventually I ended up flying Special Operations Aviation, and I led the creation of our Special Operations Aviation Squadron and doing some really cool things around the world. That was a lot of fun, but for the last 10 years I've been involved in the air defense of Canada and the United States through NORAD in a variety of positions. Currently, as mentioned, I'm the Deputy Commander of NORAD. I've got three principal responsibilities. First, I assist the Commander of NORAD in the execution of all aspects of the NORAD mission. Secondly, I command all of those Canadians who are assigned to NORAD, but outside of Canada. So you can imagine, NORAD is a Canadian and U.S. binational organization. We have Canadians that are working for NORAD in Canada. They have their own chain of command, immediate chain of command, but ultimately I command all those Canadians from Alaska to Thule, Greenland, to Vandenberg, California, and Florida, and then with us in Colorado Springs and a couple other locations that are serving for NORAD in the United States and Greenland. And then finally, I'm the senior Canadian assigned to NORAD, and I'm charged with ensuring that Canada's interests and equities are well respected as we advance the NORAD mission. I think this is what we'll talk about tonight, a little bit about NORAD and Canadian defense, something about our structure, a little bit of the history, but what I'm really going to focus on is this notion of the current security environment and the changes that have taken place, the challenges we face. I'll talk briefly about NORAD today and NORAD's future. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so, ish, and I think we've got about an hour and a half together, so there'll be lots of time for discussion or questions at the end. It's really tough to see all of you with the lights that are on, so I'd suggest if you can hold your questions till the end, that'll probably be the easiest way to handle that. Puis, s'il y en a qui vous posent des questions en français, ce serait un plaisir de les en prendre dans la langue de votre choix. Before we get going any further, though, how about a quick video, about 60 seconds, to give you a sense for what NORAD does, to lay a little bit of a taste of this framework for the current security environment, and something that I'll then build on over the rest of the quick talk here. Thanks.
For the past 60 years, we have had the watch, defending Canada and the United States 24/7, 365. Every day, we are deterring, detecting, and standing ready to defeat any air threats to our nations. For years, we have operated with the assumption that North America is a sanctuary, protected geographically by the Arctic to the north and the oceans at our coasts. Today, it is clear North America is no longer a sanctuary. As we move forward, we are rethinking how NORAD protects our nations. We are challenging our assumptions. We are developing initiatives. We are addressing the threats we face today and tomorrow. We have the watch. We will not fail.
All right. So the theme that came out in that video, that really short video, is this notion that North America is no longer a sanctuary, or as we would say in the Canadian Defense Policy document, that we're no longer secure by virtue of our geography, that our three oceans are no longer keeping Canada and the United States safe as they perhaps once were. It's due to three factors, three changes in the global security environment that we're watching closely, that we're needing to respond to. The first is the reemergence of great power competition. The second is the changing nature of conflict. And the third is the rapid evolution of technology. And taken together, these three factors have created a pretty challenging situation for the defense of North America. Before I get into the details of that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about NORAD and Canadian defense. Perhaps some of you are aware of the Canadian Defense Policy that was issued in 2017 called Strong, Secure, Engaged, lays out a future for the Canadian Armed Forces for about the next 10 years. It's based on three fundamentals. The first is being strong at home here in Canada, secure in North America in coordination with the United States, especially through NORAD. And the third is for Canada to be engaged in the world. Certainly NORAD figures prominently in the first two, being strong at home and secure in North America. There is, in Strong, Secure, Engaged, one recommendation, the very last one, so of the 111 recommendations, this one that's quoted here refers directly to NORAD and the need to modernize. Now, I believe that the world's moved on and shifted significantly since the time that Strong and Secure Engaged was created, probably in about the 2014-2015 time frame, written in 2016 and given to us in 2017. We've seen a lot of changes in the world actually in the last 5 years, changes that affect the security and defense of North America. And so the impetus to move on with modernizing NORAD is at least as strong now as it was at the time that this was written. I'll also mention another little tidbit that's important to keep in mind, perhaps especially if we go down certain lines of questions later. NORAD is not like the Air Force or the Army or the Navy for that matter. We don't create the capabilities that are employed. The Army and the Navy do. They determine what aircraft the Canadian Forces will operate with, how to train the pilots, what the pilots have to, the standards they need to meet, how they operate. NORAD, on the other hand, is what we call a force employer. We receive capabilities that are provided to us by the Canadian and U.S. militaries, by the RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the United States Air Force. So we don't get to really determine what it is that's provided. We simply get these forces from the U.S. and Canada and then employ them to the best of our ability to mitigate the risks and the challenges that we face. It puts us in a little bit of a unique situation where we're dependent on others to provide us the capabilities that we require. Of course, we identify to the government what those capability requirements are that we have, but then decisions are made by others to determine what it is we have and how we employ it. We've talked about strong, secure, and engaged, and the recommendation. So NORAD itself. NORAD is unique, perhaps unique in the world, in that it's what we call a binational command. The commander of NORAD, represented by the 4 stars here, is responsive and responsible to both a Canadian and an American chain of command. Chief of Defense Staff on the Canadian side and the Secretary of Defense on the U.S. side. This is different than other arrangements where we might employ Canadian forces, like in a coalition, a United Nations coalition operation in Bosnia or Africa, or a multilateral operation that we might be involved in, like what we're doing in other parts of the world from time to time, where chains of command remain unique and along national lines. So this is a special situation and results in Canadians and Americans working side by side, shoulder to shoulder. It's worth noting that both the commander and the deputy, that's my position, are approved and confirmed by both Canadian and U.S. governments before we assume our positions. The NORAD receives its authorities through a binational document, or the NORAD agreement itself. The NORAD agreement is a treaty-level kind of document signed by Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs Canada, but at the time Foreign Affairs and the Department of State in the United States. Treaty-level document gives us our authorities, as well as the terms of reference, which is a one-level down document provided direction to the commander of NORAD on how to do his business with a little bit more tactical detail involved. This is a photo of our headquarters. Since the inception of NORAD in about 1958, NORAD has always been paired with a major U.S. combatant command. Since 2002, the commander of NORAD has been double-hatted, we say, as the commander of NORAD and the commander of U.S. Northern Command. And so that's the headquarters of both NORAD and Northern Command. We've got about 2,000 people working there and a whole bunch of Canadians, about 150 Canadians working in Colorado Springs supporting the NORAD mission, another 150 in various locations in the United States. There's a command center down in the bottom of the headquarters here, but more importantly, and perhaps more part of the popular culture, we also maintain a command center inside Cheyenne Mountain. Some of you are perhaps familiar with movies that have been made of that facility. Day to day, we're operating here out of the basement of building number 2, it's called, whereas from time to time, we actually go up and operate still out of the mountain. But what is it that NORAD does and how do we do it? NORAD is responsible to deter, detect, and defeat air threats to the United States and Canada, and we provide aerospace and maritime warning. The NORAD agreement assigns 3 missions to NORAD, and I'm going to go through those in detail a little bit on the next slide. But before we move on, just that notion that NORAD is this binational command with Americans and Canadians working side by side to deal with the air threats to both of our nations. So we'll have Canadians and Americans, literally, in all of the locations where NORAD is present throughout the United States and Canada, both Canadians and Americans working together for our common air defense. A little bit of detail now on how we accomplish our mission. The 3 missions that are assigned to NORAD in the NORAD agreement, the first is that I'll talk about is maritime warning. Maritime warning was assigned to NORAD in the last time the NORAD agreement was signed in 2006. It's an intel and operations fusion function. To do it, we receive information from maritime stakeholders, people that are collecting maritime information around the world, and we process that and analyze it. And then if an activity or an event is deemed to be a threat to Canada or the United States, then we warn our counterparts in both capitals, Ottawa and Washington, and a couple of other locations of what the threat is. I'm not going to talk anymore really throughout this on the maritime portion. It's an interesting mission. We could talk about that if you'd like in question and answer. The second mission that I'll talk about is also a warning mission, but it's called aerospace warning. It's a little bit closer to NORAD's bread and butter in the air domain. To accomplish aerospace warning, we monitor the world globally for threats in air and space that could constitute a threat or an attack on North America. We're looking for aircraft, space vehicles, and missiles that could become a threat that could be attacking North America. We monitor globally using ground-based sensors and space-based sensors. We detect an awful lot of activity, but we conduct about 800 assessments a year. So about 800 of those many things that we detect, we actually conduct an assessment on where we look at the information that's provided, whether it be a launch of a missile somewhere in the world or a re-entry of a spacecraft, and then we assess by considering all of the other factors that may be involved, what's going on geopolitically, changes in troop movements or forces, communications that we're perhaps aware of, that would indicate whether or not that activity may or may not be a threat. And then we make an assessment, pass that on to Ottawa or Washington, and others take actions that may be required. But finally, the mission that we're perhaps best known for is aerospace control, represented here by the Russian Bear bomber, being escorted by a couple of Canadian F-18 Hornets and one American F-22 Raptor, and the person taking the picture is in another one, of course. This was over the Arctic about a year ago. The aerospace control mission involves maintaining operational control of the airspace over Canada and the United States. We survey the airspace around Canada and the United States, and then where required, we respond tactically or operationally to events that are occurring. We use ground-based sensors, radars, to do that, and we respond with airborne warning and control aircraft, tanker aircraft, fighter aircraft like here, as well as some places we have helicopters and a few missile systems. We do respond on many occasions to these kind of activities. Probably we take some form of action about 500 times a year. That might be just pilots being directed to suit up or get ready to respond, or actually going out and conducting an intercept, like in this case. NORAD, about 60 years old. Let's just talk about the history of NORAD for a moment. It might be difficult to read, but I'll walk you through what this slide's all about. When NORAD was formed in 1958, when the first NORAD agreement was signed, we were established in order to address a threat of Soviet long-range bombers proceeding through Canada, over the northern territories of the United States, the northern parts of the United States, in order to drop nuclear-armed gravity bombs on military and industrial targets in the northern United States. To counter that, we established a string of radar lines across Canada. We built the distant early warning line from Alaska over northern Canada through Greenland and out to Iceland. And we employed many fighter aircraft. NORAD was pretty big back in the 1960s. Had about 250,000 people in January 1961 under the command of Commander NORAD, 250,000 people, about 1,200 aircraft on immediate standby, with another 800 available if required, about 5,000 missiles, all working through about 58 command and control nodes. Just to compare that for size, today's Royal Canadian Air Force is about 12,000 people. So NORAD back in 1961 was an enormous organization. But we have changed and we have evolved over time, and this represents some of the changes that have occurred in NORAD. I would say that phase of NORAD that I just described to counter the Soviet long-range bombers was phase one. Second phase of NORAD occurred in 1985 as the Soviets fielded their first generation of cruise missiles. Cruise missiles that where the aircraft no longer had to fly over Canada in order to attack targets either in Canada or the United States. And so we had to change our defenses. Following the Shamrock Summit of President Reagan and Prime Minister Mulroney in 1985, the NORAD, or the North American Air Defense Modernization Agreement, was signed, and we replaced the DEW line, the Distant Early Warning line, with the North Warning System. We created forward operating locations to allow us to operate further north in the Arctic. We introduced fourth-generation fighters into NORAD service, like the Canadian F-18 and American F-16s and F-15s. It's worth noting that those are still all of the same equipment and capabilities that we have today, those that were established in the mid-1980s. NORAD was again, we entered a third phase, as some of you could probably anticipate, after 9/11. So the events of 9/11 changed NORAD in significant ways. Prior to 9/11, if you were in a NORAD command center and you were looking at our screens, you would have seen all of the air tracks approaching North America from the exterior, and it would have been largely black over Canada and the United States, because we were only prepared for threats coming in from the approaches to North America. 9/11, of course, highlighted that threats could originate from over North America, and we needed to be prepared to deal with that threat as well. We established all sorts of new relationships with security partners in both Canada and the United States, and changed our authorities as well in order to be able to respond to what was effectively internal threats instead of just the threats posed by perhaps Russian or Soviet aircraft. The line here, this collection of changes notes some of the events that occurred globally that led to these changes in NORAD structure. I would say that today we're entering the fourth phase of NORAD with some new threats. And so the nuclear threat to Canada and the United States largely diminished at the end of the Cold War, but then reappeared after that time and is sustained. The events of 9/11 brought us a terrorist threat that continues to this day. What is new, though, is that today there are conventional or non-nuclear kinetic and non-kinetic threats. So that what I mean are attacks that can actually occur on North America, on Canada and the United States. Those threats didn't exist prior to the recent period that we're entering now. Adversary states were unable to reach out with conventional weapons of any form, kinetic or non-kinetic, and touch us here in North America. That's no longer the case. And all of this change is occurring now in an environment where few perceive the change in threat, and we are more challenged than perhaps we've been in the past in our ability to respond quickly or adapt to the changing environment. I'd like to talk now about the global security environment that's associated with that changing threat situation. The current security climate is, as I mentioned earlier, characterized by three things. A shifting balance of power, or the reemergence of great power competition, says the same thing. The changing nature of conflict, and the rapid evolution of technology. It's our view in NORAD that Russia, in particular, is not acting in a cooperative manner with the West. At the end of the Soviet era, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we saw Russia enter into cooperative arrangements with NATO, and it looked as though we were on a path to cooperation with Russia. That's clearly not the case in our view today, as we've seen Russia carry on aggressively in the cyber domain and in other ways with their neighbors and other nations. Perhaps more challenging, though, is what we're seeing in terms of the capabilities being developed by Russia and to some degree by China. Russia has developed a family of advanced cruise missiles that are extremely long range, have high precision, and are extremely difficult to detect. To some degree, they're stealthy. This family of cruise missiles have capabilities that approach those of the West. We also know that they're developing new weapon systems like hypersonic cruise missiles, for example. They've modernized their aircraft, to some degree represented by the Blackjack bomber here. They've modernized their aircraft, they've modernized their submarines, and they've fielded a new fleet of extremely difficult to detect and long endurance submarines that are specially designed to launch those cruise missiles. Those weren't the only threats, of course, from Russia. They've always had ICBMs, or at least for the last 50 years, have had ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles that they can attack North America with. But the ICBMs of today are not your father's ICBMs, if I can say that. They're far more advanced. They have maneuvering capabilities, countermeasures capabilities, and are extremely difficult for us to detect and to counter. But it's not just the capabilities of our adversaries that are concerning to us. We look as well at their actions. We see that Russia is violating state boundaries. They're using military force for the first time since the Second World War to change state boundaries like they did with Crimea. We see a violation of international norms, like Russia and China are both conducting and ignoring of international will by North Korea. Challenging democratic processes by Russia in both the United States and Europe. We see Russia and China challenging the Western-led, rules-based international order, the liberal democratic order that was established after the Second World War that provides the prosperity that we've all enjoyed for the last 70 years. All that clearly being challenged by Russia. Russia's increased their Arctic presence in ways that we shouldn't be ignoring. And then if we think that all of this was just for the specialists and military people like myself to observe, when Russia deployed her latest frigate, or naval vessel, through the Caribbean on a world cruise last summer, they docked the Gorshkov, it's called, in Havana, Cuba. And while there, the Russian embassy in Washington tweeted a message, and I guess tweets are the way to communicate today, tweeted a message indicating that we should all be aware that the Gorshkov is armed with long-range cruise missiles while in Havana. So while we were all focused for the last 20 years or so on the asymmetric threat, we call it, the threat coming out of 9/11, while we were focused on countering violent extremism and terrorism, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, our adversaries were developing the ability to affect us through conventional means, below the threshold for nuclear war, and in emerging domains like cyber and information warfare. So what does that mean for NORAD today? We at NORAD characterize threats in two ways, by the capability and the intent associated with the threat. Previously, I described some of the capabilities that our adversaries are developing. It's a military problem, and we're watching that closely and have a very good idea what it means for us in terms of our adversaries' abilities. And the second aspect of threat is intent, so capability and intent. The intent is far more difficult to discern or ascertain than capability. It also can change very quickly, but we believe that actions of others indicates to some degree what their intent might be. And I've talked about some of those actions as well a moment ago. Where it leaves us today is we also believe that one of the primary purposes of defending the continent, of defending North America, is to ensure that our diplomats are able to engage and operate from a position of strength. We believe that our diplomats are most effective when they can engage with their counterparts, knowing that we're secure here at North America, that they can't be coerced, and that we can establish a position or a line that is representative of the Canadian or, for NORAD, at least the American position. Our adversaries, by developing advanced capabilities, while our capabilities have not been changing, are changing the balance of that distribution of power, and I don't believe, is well positioned to ensure that our diplomats are negotiating from that position of strength which we would seek. A second idea that it's brought to bear for us is that this is allowing our adversaries to compete below the nuclear threshold. For many years, certainly since the end of the Second World War, the foundation of North American security has been based on three concepts: forward defense, collective security through organizations like NATO and the United Nations, all backed by a nuclear deterrent, mutually assured destruction, so a strategic nuclear deterrent backing it all. But it wasn't based on the notion that we had to defend at our borders of Canada and the United States. It's forward defense and collective security, and if all failed, we had the nuclear deterrent to try and balance the threat from the Soviet Union or Russia. Today, both Russia and China are or are developing the capability to hold us at risk below that nuclear threshold. They're negating the notion that we're secure simply by being able to project force through forward defense or collective security. We're being held at risk here in the approaches and in the territory of North America. They're also demonstrating an ability to compete below the level of armed conflict. China seizing international property, moving into the South China Sea in ways that we've not been able to address or counter. Russia challenging the sovereignty of its neighbors, acting on a model that's built to affect the decision-making of the West through the use of non-kinetic threats and attacks, perhaps through cyberspace, and as a precursor, if necessary, for kinetic attacks. All of this is changing the landscape for NORAD, and we need to rethink the way we think about the defense of North America. It's clear that what's worked in the past is not going to work in the future. I'll talk about that in a minute, but just to drive home a couple of notions on what this means for us here in Canada. Our adversaries now have the capabilities to offset our strengths and exploit our vulnerabilities. They can hold us at risk in North America. So if we think about strong at home, strong, secure, engaged, strong at home, secure in North America, and engaged in the world, what does that mean for us? Russia is focused on the ability to affect our decision-making through the non-kinetic attacks on, we believe, our critical civilian and economic infrastructure. Examples would be attacking the hydroelectric facility in Quebec, or an oil or gas pipeline from Western Canada into the United States. These would be the kinds of critical infrastructure that we would need to defend as Canadians to keep North America secure in order to ensure that the decision-making was not being affected. If we think about being secure in North America, the second aspect of strong, secure, engaged, it's clear that as a partner in North American defense, Canada has to do its part. We can't leave the security of North America completely to the United States, that we have a stake in this as well because of the shared infrastructure and shared responsibilities for the defense of North America. And thirdly, being engaged in the world, Canada is a close ally of the United States, a close ally within NATO, and it's our expectation, it's your expectation that Canada is going to do its part to promote peace and security around the world. If we're not secure here in Canada, or here in North America, that impacts on our ability to project forces elsewhere. If we were being subject to an attack in North America, I can't imagine that we as Canadians would want our forces going elsewhere prior to ensuring that we're secure here. So it's a bit of a game changer, this notion that we're no longer secure here in North America as we once were. NORAD's a key stakeholder in the defense of North America, and we've got to think about how we're going to address these new requirements and NORAD in the future. So for us, this is about a fundamental shift in mindset. I'll say that two things. It talks to a warfighter's mindset that's required for NORAD, and for NORAD to present a credible defense against and to be prepared to respond decisively to attacks, especially those by peer adversaries. I think it would be fair for you to say to me, as the Deputy Commander of NORAD, well, why is it that you don't have a warfighter's mindset already? Why is that a transformational thing? And what do you mean you don't have a credible defense today? And I think I'd answer that by saying, well, for a generation, with our limited defense capabilities and resources in both Canada and the United States, we've been focused on another problem. For a considerable period of time, we've been taking our defense resources and assets and trying to deal with violent extremism, the terrorism threat. And these changes are recent. The changes are recent in the terms of an adversary's ability to hold us at risk here in North America. We have yet to respond to those changes appropriately. And so the notion that we take a warfighter's mindset to defending North America is new. Previous generations of Canadian military leaders have looked at ensuring that we had strong abilities to contribute to forward defense and collective security. We've left the home game effectively to the strategic deterrence and that umbrella that's been provided by the West. So this is a change that's required, this notion that we need to actively defend North America in ways that we haven't had to before. And really it comes down to reestablishing deterrence. The deterrence that was provided by the nuclear response is a deterrence by punishment. It doesn't apply, isn't applicable to the kind of threats that we're facing today. We need to establish deterrence based on the ability to deny an adversary the benefit of their attack. That's different than saying, yeah, if you attack us, we're going to hit you back really hard. It's a type of deterrence that's based on the notion that we're going to blunt an attack sufficiently that it changes our adversary's calculus. Part of that existed at times during the Cold War. It's diminished. It needs to be reestablished. There's also this notion that there's a logic chain that goes from, we need to be able to detect in order to defeat a threat, and then we need to be able to defeat a threat in order to deter it. So it goes from detect to defeat to deter. If what we're trying to do is establish deterrence, we need credible ability to detect and then to defeat. And the result will be deterrence. Given the advances that our adversaries have made in developing new weapon systems, it's that rapid evolution of technology that I've talked about. We need to get on top of our ability to reestablish credible sensing and defeat capabilities. In addition, threats of today they've changed in nature. The nature of conflicts changed. The nature of the threats that face North America have also changed. And it's not just NORAD with our air domain focus that we have a monopoly on the defense of North America. We have a couple of partners. United States Northern Command, we share the building with them, and Canadian Joint Operations Command, who are responsible for Canadian operations, are also responsible for their parts of the defense of North America. And we're working together closely with them for this layered approach to the defense of North America. But finally, there's a global aspect to the defense of North America. We say that threats today are transregional, multifunctional, and all-domain. That's a big expression to say that whatever's happening elsewhere in the world has an impact here in North America. When Russia was conducting its operations against Crimea, that had an impact on how Russia was acting here, across from Alaska, and the way that they were viewing our operations. Were we responding to what they were doing in Crimea by what we were doing up in Alaska? When China and Russia are flying aircraft in the Sea of Japan together and being intercepted by Japanese, American, and South Korean aircraft, what's the global message of that? How is it connected to what's happening in Europe on Russia's other border, and how does that affect North America? So we're starting to take a much more integrated approach to the defense of North America, so that what U.S. European Command and what NATO are doing vis-a-vis Russia is well coordinated with what we're doing. And again, that might seem new, but or it should seem natural, perhaps to some of you, but it's new for us in a military sense. And that's not all. I mentioned that we need to update our defenses in order to be able to detect and defeat. And so there's a technological aspect to NORAD of the future and the modernization that's required. Previously, back when I talked about NORAD in 1961 and being huge and enormous and powerful, at that time, about 30% of global research and development was a result of U.S. Department of Defense efforts. That's no longer the case. Today, perhaps 5% of global R&D comes out of the U.S. Department of Defense. Today, it's places like here in Waterloo. It's private sector and industry that are responsible for most of the innovation and the research development going on in the world today. But we're not connected well to that in NORAD. We are pursuing ways and means to increase our connection with industry to allow them to work some of the solutions to the problems we're currently facing. We're working with SpaceX, for example, on ways that we can leverage their advances for the benefit of industry. Finally, we're working on transforming our own command. How can we change our structure? What authorities can we shift within the current framework that will allow us to better deal with the threats that we face? I'm just about done. Unfortunately today, given the time we've got, but perhaps there'll be time during questions, I was unable to address other areas such as the Arctic. So I didn't make much mention of the Arctic. I didn't discuss unmanned aerial systems, what you might call drones, and the threat that they might present to us here in North America and how we're countering unmanned aerial systems. I didn't really talk about much of the innovation that we're involved in, and I certainly didn't touch on cyber threats and the way they affect both NORAD and defense of North America. So in summary, the key message, if I could leave you with one message to take home, it's the one that I mentioned earlier, that North America is not a sanctuary. We're no longer secure here in Canada or the United States by virtue simply of our geography. That's going to require a new mindset, new partnerships, new capabilities, and innovation in order to restore the deterrence that we're going to seek here in North America. So finally, thanks for your attention. Thanks for an opportunity to talk about NORAD, a subject that perhaps we don't address very often, and I'd look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Grab a seat. Yeah, grab a seat. Thank you very much for those insightful remarks, and I would love to talk a little bit tonight about the Arctic, drones, and cyber. No, I say that just, but I do. Yeah, no, you hit on all of them. No, I do want to come to that, but before we dive in, I also want to indicate that this is a conversation with the audience. So we have microphones. Are we still doing the box things? Yeah, so we have microphone boxes. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to put up your hand. One of the volunteers will bring the box over, and you can have a conversation with us as we're talking about these security challenges. And we enjoy the conversation. So before we get to the kind of the leading edge of the threats, the cyber and the drones and those sets of challenges that we're seeing as well in the Arctic, I want to take a step back. And so your presentation was great, and I was struck by where NORAD started, where it's going to, but how quickly it's gotten there. And it strikes me like a layperson looking at this as though the pace of change is getting faster. So you start with principally looking at the Russian threat, long-range bombers. That's one set of challenges. You fast forward, and then it's 9/11 and internal threats. Now we're looking at new powers rising and technological change. That's a really quick pace for an organization to deal with. How are you addressing that pace of change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks. I thought you were going to start with an easy question.
Yeah.
No.
What do you think of the auditorium?
Yeah, it's great. I think the way that we do it is building on what we've got. We start with that, and the commander invokes this notion of a new, and new old. And so we realize that because of the pace of change, where we find ourselves today, we are going to need to leapfrog in terms of getting to where we need to be. But that's going to take some time to get there. We need really to advance the capabilities that we've got. So some sort of a small evolutionary change that's required to advance those capabilities that we currently have. So the current North Warning System, for example, a string of radars on the northern shores of Canada and the United States. Maybe we can change the way that the signals are processed without having to actually change the antenna in a way that will allow us to eke a little bit more capacity out of those while we're working on new solutions like over-the-horizon radar or a space-based solution, the stuff that we're doing with SpaceX. So we're taking a sort of a twin-track approach where we're looking at how can we advance, modernize to some degree, new, old, the capabilities that we currently have, but then where are there opportunities as well for innovation, new, that allow us to leapfrog and develop the capabilities for the next century. The commander has spent some time at the McLaren Innovation Lab in the United Kingdom, looking at the way they're applying command and control with their problem set, which really is race car driving and performance. But it's a bit of an analog for some of the command and control challenges that we have in terms of modernizing. We're working on prototyping a new command and control system through Defense Innovation Unit in the United States. I'm here in Ontario trying to look for opportunities to partner along the technology lines as well in Canada. So twin track approach, and then of course there's the notion that we have to inform governments and leadership so that the resources are there when we need them.
Nice. So thinking about the interplay between the government and specifically the Canadian forces and our technology sector, it's apropos that you're here in Waterloo, but I wonder if someone from the government goes into a tech company and says, "Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to help." If those wouldn't be the scariest set of words that one could offer, and so the relationship between the government and the tech sector is broken, and I wonder, and I don't want to get into a talk about procurement because I don't want to put the audience to sleep, but can we talk about procurement for a minute? Is there something that we can be doing where we can be working more hand in hand with tech companies to advance the interests of the Canadian forces, but also to build the tech companies here locally that are working on some of these innovations?
Yeah. I'm not a procurement expert, and it's a public forum, so I'll keep my comments perhaps within those things that I deal with in NORAD. What I would say is that I think the way that we've procured capabilities for the Canadian Armed Forces for, I'll say the last generation, since I've been in uniform, has been largely oriented around a different problem set. It's been oriented around the notion that we're arming the Canadian Armed Forces to participate in, as I mentioned earlier, for defense, collective security kinds of operations. And there's been an opportunity to determine where, when, and how those capabilities are brought online. To say, well, maybe not next year, but the year after, and that'll be sufficient because the risk isn't imminent. The consequences of delay, perhaps, some other ally can fill that gap while we develop these capabilities, and and then eventually that's why alliances are good. It allows us to offset one another, and so there was. I think that's the way risk was managed. That risk may have been managed in a way that reduced it to the taxpayer, and what was at stake were Canadian contributions to alliance operations. Perhaps. Where we find ourselves today, from a NORAD perspective, is that we need capability now in a non-discretionary sense. That North America, we believe, is at risk in ways that it hasn't been, and that's the risk that we need to mitigate, perhaps at the expense of the other kinds of risks that have been worked out of the system. And that might sound a little confusing. So what I mean is, maybe we have to change the way we do business and go, all right, what's most important right now is not delivering in terms of a particular set of parameters that are most beneficial to some economic sector or the other kind of parameters that have been associated with defense procurement. What we really need to do is solve this problem. This is critical to the nation, and so time is of the essence. Let's get capability in the hands of the military as quickly as we can. And that's not the approach necessarily that's always been taken. And so I think there's an opportunity to reshape how we approach the problem, being driven by the fact that this isn't about sending troops off to fight with a coalition. This is about defending North America.
And that's actually, I think, an interesting point to pivot to cyber, right? So we've got a new threat vector now, and new capabilities are required. And actually, I appreciate the strong, secure, engaged defense policy, and I appreciate the creation of cyber operators. Is this something that's fundamentally different that you guys are thinking about, or is this kind of, as they say, old wine in new bottles? Is it something that's we've seen before? Just it's a different vector.
No, this is new. It's very new. It's new in many different ways. And the way that cyber plays for us as defenders of North America is that it's not something that we own. So we own the aircraft that go out and intercept. We own the mission. We own the decision. We own the risk. We're accountable if we fail. But cyber isn't that way on our side, nor is it very attributable. So it is a bit of a game changer. We are in partnership with other military organizations as well as civilian organizations and other government departments to try and identify and mitigate cyber risks. There are a few cyber capabilities that we do own and we're responsible for the protection of. We believe that we don't have enough cyber defenders for all of those systems. Some of those will be technological solutions and some require more people to go out and operate on networks, to operate our cyber defenses. And so there's a demand signal from the one side in terms of increasing our capacity and capabilities for cyber defense, all within an environment that's evolving, changing, and a lot of discovery occurring at the same time. And how do we interact with those other military organizations? How do we interact with our other government partners in terms of cyber defense? It's an area of great interest at the moment.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the really tricky parts is how do you know when you're actually at war in the cyber domain, right? Like, it's one of these things where we've got these traditional concepts of what conflict is and how war fighting is done. But again, not to come back to the defense policy, one of my favorite lines in there is about this hybrid conflict or the gray zone where our adversaries are purposefully trying to operate below the threshold of armed conflict because they're trying to move up the rungs of aggression, but they're trying to stay below the threshold where they're going to get a conventional response. So it makes it a lot trickier in that sense, I would imagine, too.
Yeah, very much so. There are norms, standards, and to some degree treaties and conventions that have been established over the years through The Hague and other means that establish what the norms are for conflict. None of that has occurred around cyber activities at the moment. So we don't have established norms of behavior. There are no published repercussions. So Canada has not clearly identified, for example, what constitutes a threshold in cyber conflict. The United States has a statement, but it's very open and I think fails to precisely indicate what the consequences would be of certain cyber activities. There's, I think, a Canadian, a Western notion that you're either at peace or at war, but our adversaries are demonstrating an ability to operate between those two extremes. They're not at peace with us, they're clearly in competition, but they're not at war, as we would define war, and it leaves us somewhat on our back foot, unable to respond because, we're not at peace, but we're not fighting yet. And they're operating in this gray zone, as we would call it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I'm an international lawyer by way of my background, and if someone were to ask me, how does international law apply to cyberspace, my answer will be, oh God, do you have 12 hours? Like, it's a complicated system. So maybe we'll turn to the audience. Do we have any questions out on the floor? Yeah, please, yep. If you just introduce yourself too, please.
David Cartwright, I'm from Waterloo. It's hard to believe that anybody's going to put the research and the billions of dollars to develop these long-range missiles without some sort of plan. Maybe the plan is just defense, like nuclear weapons were thought of in the past. If everybody has them, nobody will use them. But with the development of these long-range missiles, and also with us all being aware of the class of leaders that are in the world today, whether it's locally or North Korea or Russia, what does our intelligence tell us about the possibility of these long-range missiles being used. And I know you've got the cyber warfare, so they can shut down the computers, which shuts down the fence and then bomb you, but our intelligence must tell us, is there a strong possibility of these missiles being used against us?
Mr. Cartwright, thanks for your question. You started off your question with the notion that the billions of dollars that would be expended to develop these weapon systems is probably a purposeful action. I often get the last part of your question, which is what are they going to do with them? But people seldom make the connection to the notion that they probably had a plan before they spent these enormous national resources. And I think that's an important distinction. Like you, I agree that there is probably a plan for it. It's hard to know exactly what their plan is. I mentioned earlier that we're focused on the capability that our adversaries can develop. Intention is much harder to ascertain. Their actions provide some indication. The development of long-range weapons by Russia seems to be most likely associated with the ability to hold North America at risk.
Do we have those same long-range missiles?
Similar. We in Canada, none. No. The West does possess some, but not us in Canada. Russia used those same missiles in their operations in Syria. They didn't need to. They had other shorter-range weapons that they could have used. I think it was largely a demonstration to the West of what their capability is. For Russia to park their frigate in the Havana harbor and advertise publicly through Twitter that they were there with their cruise missiles, it's hard to believe that that's just simply a defensive activity. But defense is also in the eye of the beholder. If Russia felt threatened, and that's a perceptive property, so however they might feel threatened, I think what they're clearly indicating to us is that they have the ability to respond, to take action in some way with these new capabilities that they have. Perhaps I'll round it off by saying you all pay us in uniform to protect you, and that involves a certain degree of paranoia. And so I may be the most paranoid person in the room, and you should be happy with that. My job is to, with a very clear eye, assess the threats that are present against us here in North America. I'll advise my superiors, and they'll advise the leadership of our nation what those threats are, and a decision will be made on whether we're going to take action X or Y to deal with that. It could be that we go, no, chances are they're not going to use those weapons, carry on, NORAD. Or it could be, no, let's take this seriously. Let's ensure that our diplomats can negotiate from a position of strength. Let's establish some credible defenses here, and then it doesn't matter what Russia decides that they want to do with those systems, we have a good set of defenses. That's not a decision that will be made at my level. As a paranoid air defender of North America, I'm going to say this is the capability that's out there. These are my recommendations of what we would have to do if we want to mitigate those risks. And then it's up to the leadership of the nations, both Canada and the United States, to determine what needs to be done about it.
Do you see it as a similar situation to, I'm a little older than you, so as to what happened with JFK and the Russians back in when they had arms posted near Cuba at that time? Because Trump is no JFK, so.
Yeah. There are some similarities, I suppose, to what was going on then. I think there was a nuclear dimension that was occurring at that time, and that's what the difference is. That was nuclear gamesmanship to some degree that was being played at that time, whereas today these are conventional weapons that can be used below the nuclear threshold. And so if Russia was to attack country X with a conventional weapon, it seems unlikely that the appropriate response is to return with a nuclear weapon. That starts us down a path that's really hard to recover from. And I think that's appreciated by Russia and China, who are developing these new capabilities. And so it's similar, but I don't think it's a complete comparison.
And if I could just add a thought on this one, it's changed it's changed the perception or a military doctrine, right? We've in the West always maintained what they call second strike capability. So even if a nuclear strike was launched, we can even if we're hit, we can still launch back, right? We've got nuclear submarines, hardened silos, all sorts of stuff like that. So when you're thinking about nuclear doctrine, there's something called mutually assured destruction. If you launch a nuclear strike, you can be sure that one's coming back at you and we're both going to wipe each other out. It's a zero-sum game. This long-range conventional weapons changes that analysis, and it makes it, and maybe I'm setting myself out as the second most paranoid person in the room, but it makes it a lot easier to use them. And if you stack that on what we're seeing in cyberspace, we're actually, and rising powers, and a multipolar world, we're actually rising where we're coming into a pretty dangerous time. Sorry, we had a question over here.
Just if I build on that for a second, I think some of the military leaders around the world will tell you that we believe we're at the most dangerous point in time now since the end, or at the height of the Cold War. With the instabilities that are occurring and capabilities.
Stephen Fisher, I'm a teacher from Stratford. I'm curious about your job title, Deputy Commander, and your counterpart, Commander. How much command do you have at NORAD, say in a crisis? There was an unexpected, some sort of unexpected military action against North America. I would assume there would be contact with Washington very quickly, the Pentagon and the White House, but I would assume they're giving the commands. And maybe it's just the terminology, and I'm assuming Ottawa would be informed a few days later, what's going on, and they might express an opinion. But how much in a crisis, how much command function independently does NORAD have, if there is any?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are commanders. Well, I'm a deputy commander. He's a commander in the full military sense of the term. We have approved by both. So if you remember the organizational chart with the commander, and it goes up, splits up to both the Canadian and the U.S. sides, we have plans and rules of engagement and direction that's already pre-approved, both in Ottawa and Washington. If X happens, they know we're going to do Y. And the way we execute Y will be controlled day to day, minute to minute by the commander or me in his absence. That said, if there's time to consult with Washington and Ottawa, we'll do so. But there may not be time in all circumstances to consult. So at least they know how, they've given us direction on how they want us to respond. It could be that it's a combination of the two. It could be that we see X happening, we're going to start things in motion and start them moving, and then consult with Ottawa and Washington, say, hey, we started this, any adjustments that you'd like us to make. But I don't think that's unusual with NORAD. I think that's representative of the way most military commands work. We'll all, as commanders, will refer to our higher authority when we can, just to make sure that circumstances haven't changed much, to ensure that we don't do something that's counterproductive. We assume that our bosses know a little bit more of what's happening, and might have a different perspective, and they'll go, no, not quite yet, give it another X amount of time. So we are commanders, certainly day to day. There are a range of decisions that we make in Colorado Springs. We'll always inform. Sometimes we choose to consult before we do that, even if the commander has the authority already to make those decisions. We'll go, no, the best thing to do here is let's just talk to the Secretary of Defense or the Chief of Defense Staff, let them know what we're doing, and give them a chance to veto it if they see something that's a little different.
I think there was a thread of your question, if I got it right, was what's the interplay between the Canadians and the Americans? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall on 9/11, wasn't it a Canadian that had operational command right at the beginning of that?
Yeah, so the commander was absent, and it turns out that it wasn't even my predecessor. He became, his name was Major General Rick Findley at the time. He was in Cheyenne Mountain. They were doing an exercise as 9/11 unfolded. I know him, so I'm going to call him Rick because we know each other. He made the decisions that shut down the airspace in Canada and the United States. He was the one that deployed the fighter aircraft to the air patrols over the major cities. And it was the Canadian making those decisions. It's interesting. Each of the NORAD regions is commanded by an officer of that nation, but has a deputy from the other nation. I can recall a day a couple of years ago when something was going on, and we had a VTC, a video teleconference, going on with each of the regions, and it was all Canadians. So it was a Canadian in Tyndall, Florida, that was making a decision for the defense of the United States. And that's just the way our system's set up under NORAD. There's this high degree of trust between both nations that we're going to do. We're going to act in the best interests of each other.
Yeah, and I think there's something kind of worth mentioning. Like, a lot of what we're seeing in the public discourse is about President Trump and NAFTA and the tensions between the relationship between the two countries. But I don't think you can really state how strongly integrated we are, and NORAD is the prime example of it. I can't think of another example where there is a similar setup anywhere in the world.
Yeah, no, I believe that we're the only so-called binational command where a single commander is receiving direction from both capitals at the same time. There are parallel structures that exist, multilateral or coalition, but not a binational structure. Excuse me. There was something else, but
No, it's all good. All good. We have another question on the floor?
At the top.
Please.
Hi, it's Marcia Redmond from Waterloo, Kitchener. All the information regarding 9/11 was known beforehand in 5 or 6 various locations, higher up locations, but they did not communicate to each other. And it was an after the fact that it was like, oh my goodness, we knew that, but people did not integrate that information into how serious it was and how to protect. I guess my question is, something similar might be happening with NORAD and various other information regarding the two countries. Is there a successful type of communication happening that a serious decision could be made, not on a dime, but quickly, not with 2 weeks worth of getting information back and forth from people, but say, this is serious, we need to act now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I understand the essence of your question, but I don't know that I see the connection between your correct statement that the information associated with 9/11 was known, but it just wasn't perhaps recognized at the time. With your other, what I'm hearing is your question being, is NORAD able to make decisions rapidly and quickly? So I'll just say on the second one, absolutely. The structures are in place for us to make extremely rapid decisions if required. My response to the gentleman earlier was on the notion that if we had time, we would consult, but that the authorities exist, the plans are approved, and the commander has authority, or in his absence I do, to make immediate decisions. The events of 9/11 and the fact that information was known and not acted upon, of course, has been well researched, well studied, and as unfortunate as it might be, we're victims of our circumstances, and nobody imagined prior to that civilian aircraft would be used in that manner. And so the way we perceive the world around us is largely a result of our history and our circumstances, the way we see things. And as unfortunate as it was a failure of imagination. Part of what we're doing now by sharing our concerns over how we see the world developing today is to avoid a failure of imagination, so that somebody doesn't sit down months or years from now and go, hey, why wasn't NORAD worrying about these capabilities that were being developed by others?
And a second part to to answer your question is, after those tragic events, governments in both countries were restructured. You have the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Public Safety in Canada, largely driven by the purpose to be able to integrate that information. And as an adjunct but related point, the reason things were structured the way they were sound. We keep law enforcement over here and intelligence agencies over here and the military over there with separate lines of authority, because they're meant to do different things. But now we've got a mechanism to coordinate intelligence sharing and information sharing as between our own respective departments and between the two governments. But it's a good question. It was Marcia? Thank you for that. Okay, over here, please, yes.
Brian Hagee, retired high school teacher. Would like to jump into the cyber issues and ask for your opinions about what I will call the Huawei situation. At one hand, it seems to be very political,
Huawei?
and at the other hand, it looks like it's commercial. What are your thoughts?
Sorry, I missed the last part of the question. I'm sorry.
The question was basically how much politics versus how much cyber spying is at play here?
Yeah, so I'm afraid I don't have direct knowledge or awareness of the threats and the risks associated with Huawei and their 5G technology. It would be third hand. I'd be passing on to you what I have heard from others, and I don't think that's appropriate.
And for me, like I'm an interested observer, but I'm a civilian, so I don't have access to any of the inside information. But what I will say is, what you do see in the public record is agencies in the United States warning Canada quite strongly against it. My guess is they're not doing that for their health. There's probably a compelling national security reason behind that. And the one thing that we do not want to jeopardize in this country is our ability to be part of intelligence sharing arrangements. Actually, to Marcia's question, with our partners, it is so important for us to stay united as we're moving into this new threatscape. It's so important for us to be able to share information about our adversaries that are being more aggressive. So anything that we would do that would jeopardize that is probably the reward isn't going to be worth the risk, especially if it's just to have faster phones. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Tamara Lawrence. I'm a PhD student here at the Balsillie School. I have a couple of quick questions and then a couple of comments. So my questions are, what are the new systems or technologies that Canada needs for its contribution to NORAD for this transformation that you were describing? And then my other question is, what are the structures of public oversight? Because I'm concerned about illegal surveillance and cyber attacks. And then my comments are, you mentioned in your presentation about the DEW line, and I'm thinking about how the radar installations across the Arctic, contaminated indigenous land. And the US left us with a bill of over $500 million for the cleanup. I mean, the United States refused to pay its full share for the cleanup costs, so it was Canadian taxpayers that were left to foot the bill. And indigenous communities today are concerned about any modernization of radar systems or in the Arctic and how that could impact their communities. And then the way you described Russia, I think, as a threat is totally overblown. The United States spends $650 billion on its military. Russia is ranked 6th. It spends 1/10 on its military, $60 billion. Russia is surrounded by NATO troops. We've got Canadian and NATO troops in Latvia, Poland, and the Ukraine. Canada is leading a NATO battle group in Latvia, right on Russia's border. So Russia is under pressure from NATO in Eastern Europe. And then with Crimea too, just to say that there was a referendum in 2014. I mean, most of the population in Crimea is Russian. They had a vote. They said they wanted to stay in Russia, and they're staying in Russia. And you know that Russia has a major naval base in Crimea, so it doesn't want the Ukraine to go to NATO. It doesn't want Crimea to be under NATO. But NATO is putting intense pressure on Russia. So. I think that threat is overblown, and I think that we really, the real global challenges that we're facing, which is catastrophic climate change. We're in a climate emergency. We need to partner with Russia and China on our common security challenges. And then the final point is, in the spring of 2018, the UN Secretary General announced a UN agenda for disarmament. Wanting international communities, the international community, states to start reducing military spending, starting to disarm in order to work on the global challenges that we have, catastrophic climate change and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So I'd appreciate your comments. And
there's quite a bit there.
Yeah, I got some good notes.
So,
Ms. Lawrence, thanks for your comments. In terms of the new systems and technologies that NORAD would be looking for from Canada, I'd group them into three categories. The first are intuitive layered sensing systems that allow us to detect threats at range. The second category would be advanced defeat mechanisms that allow us to flip the cost curve on defeating threats that may be attacking Canada and the United States. And the third would be a command and control system, a modernized command and control system that links those two together. So sensors, defeat mechanisms, advanced defeat mechanisms that are deep magazine, affordable, et cetera, and a command and control system. You asked about structures of public oversight and concerns with respect to cyber attacks. I'll just say that those functions are outside of the NORAD scope, so I'll just pass
I can help on that one. So the starting premise that I take when I talk about national security and intelligence review and oversight is that we need to understand that there's bad people in the world that want to do really bad things, and that we need to be able to have intelligence in order to gauge those threats and be able to respond to them accordingly. So that's my starting premise for the answer. Then I'll say that the national security and intelligence review structures in this country are extremely good. We have something called the NSICOP, which is the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. So we have civilian oversight from democratically elected leaders over our intelligence apparatus. Then we also now have a superstructure that has both review and oversight functions. And what I mean by review is a national security agency does something, and then someone looks at what they did, and they tell them whether that was bad or good. And they have an oversight function, which means during an actual operation, they're involved in it. We have one of the better structures in the world to make sure that those capabilities aren't misused. So that's how I would answer that piece of it.
Your next point was on the radar installations that were established in the Canadian North, and when we transitioned from the distant early warning line to the North Warning System, there was a massive cleanup that was required. I am not in a position to comment on who paid for what. My understanding is that over many years we finally completed the cleanup. Canada, a couple of years ago. I can find out more details on how that was financed if you'd like, but what I would say is that we're currently involved in the expansion for NORAD of the runway at Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, and that's being done completely in accordance with the current structures in the territories, in conjunction with and through the First Nations and the Inuit corporations that are responsible for the infrastructure in the north. So it's being done in a partnership sense, supported by the federal government on behalf of Department of National Defense, but in strong cooperation. You have an interesting point on whether the Russian threat is overblown, with the U.S. spending $600 billion and Russia at about $100 billion. That's true, but the way that the military-industrial complex functions in Russia, works at about 10 to 1 in terms of output for dollars spent because of the way that it's not free market or enterprise. There's no competitive bidding required, and so we estimate that they're getting about 10 to 1 on the dollar. They're also the largest expense for Western militaries is on their personnel. That is clearly not the largest expense for Russia and her military. So we believe that Russia is able to generate far in excess of what we can generate, we the West, on a dollar per dollar basis. So I understand the concern, but I think it's understood within the context of how the finances work.
Can I add one point to that
Sure.
too? This actually stacks on the cyber piece. We talked a lot about cyber warfare, but there's also economic cyber espionage, and the new Chinese stealth fighter looks an awful lot like the one that we have, and so there's probably some espionage going on that decreases their R&D budget as well.
Yeah, and so the question was specifically about Russia, but had it been about China, absolutely agree 100%. That the way that they've been able to advance their capabilities in a short period of time, we believe reflects strongly on what we think is intellectual property theft. Thanks for your comments on Crimea and Russia's actions there and the referendum that was held. I think to our view, it represents Russian military action in terms of a hybrid warfare technique that was used to achieve the end state that currently exists in Crimea. I don't know that it would be categorized as free and open kind of elections to a Western standard that took place. And then I understand the concern on climate change, and that's certainly one that the government will have to balance in terms of all of the other priorities that are that we face currently. And finally, your question on, or your comment about Secretary General seeking disarmament. I can't dispute that. I think that's a noble goal, and we would all like to achieve that. But as a military officer, responsible for the air defense of North America, I think it would be disingenuine if I was to not bring to the attention of either my superiors or, when applicable, the wider audience, the threats that I believe we face. The decisions will be made by others, and in terms of what we do about it. But it's my duty to bring to attention my best assessment of the threats we face. Others will decide the most appropriate response and strategy to be taken. That may be disarmament, it may not.
Okay, I think we have got time for one more question. Yeah, please.
Yeah, my name is Brian Finlayson from Kitchener, and my question concerns Arctic security, and particularly in view of the rise of China. And my understanding, I mean, you've mentioned Russia several times, and I think we're familiar with Russian belligerence and so forth, but in view of China's economic expansion, which is enormous, despite domestic economic woes, it's happening nonetheless, particularly into the Middle East, but I understand China also has ambitions in the Arctic. And I'm wondering, in view of the unresolved sovereignty claims in the Arctic, that would be Denmark, Russia, Canada, and the US, how you see China perhaps having any future investment or threat impact perhaps to North America in the Arctic. What are the chances of resolving those sovereignty claims, and how do you see China playing into that?
It's a pretty good question.
It is. It is, and I'm thinking I'd probably get outside the air defense mandate that I have with NORAD and what we do. So I'm trying to quickly think of a way to link it to the NORAD mandate. What I'll say is the Arctic has always been an area of concern, and I'm unfortunately not going to be able to directly answer your question. It's outside of sort of NORAD lanes, but the Arctic has always been of significant concern to NORAD. In 1957, 58, when we were created, it was the avenue of approach for the threat to North America by the Soviet long-range bombers. It was was the NORAD requirement that established the DO line because that was the most effective way to detect the threats and respond. There was we've had a NORAD presence in the Arctic for the last 70 years in one form or another. I think what we see is an environment that's becoming, and I don't mean a geophysical environment, I mean a more geopolitical environment. We find an environment where the Arctic is becoming of increasing relevance and concern, and that NORAD seeks to be a responsible player as we move forward and determine what our requirements will be in the 21st century in the Arctic. We are concerned about some Chinese activity in the maritime domain. NORAD has a maritime warning function, and so we're watching that closely. It does concern us at the moment, but up till now, everything that has been done by China is consistent with international law and norms, but we're watching it very closely.
And if you're game to do a little bit of reading, we just released a report on Arctic governance. And so my colleague Brian, will you throw up your hand? Brian works on our community engagements team. If you give your email to Brian, he can email you a copy of that report. And that's it. That's all we got time for, unfortunately. So,
Thank you.
Let me just add one closing thought to what we've heard here tonight. You are obviously you're a gifted public speaker. You're knowledgeable about the world, and you've had an exemplary career. But the thing that strikes me the most is your dedication to the job that you're doing, and just how important that job is, given the threats that we're facing in this country and indeed around the world. So I'm heartened by the fact that you guys are on the watch, and thank you for everything you do. Please join me in thanking our speaker.